Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I confess that I am 11 years too late. But, on the other hand, never let it be said that it's too late to do the right thing. I've mentioned before my father's habit of getting so excited about new interests that he would bounce around from this hobby to that hobby, and that whenever he would enter into a new hobby, he would gather together first everything that he could to read about the new subject he was interested in, and then he would go and gather all the tools that he needed to do this, whether he was learning about painting or learning about playing violin or learning about astronomy. That was his habit. And though it's not quite the same thing, he had a similar capacity to grow really excited about particular books that he was reading. And instead of going out and getting everything he could on the book, he would get the book for everyone. I remember one time he'd come to visit me. I was an adult and I was living in another state and out in the country somewhere, and he, who doesn't much care for going on car trips, wanted to drive a half an hour to the closest mall in order to get to the bookstore in order to get me a copy of some particular diet book that he was beyond within weeks. Well, one of the books that he actually bought for me, one could argue had the potential anyway of having a long shelf life. The book that I'm talking about for today's Curating Your Book Library is simply called The Next 100 Years. The Next 100 Years, a forecast for the 21st century. The author's name is George Friedman. My father got me the book and gave it to me, and I started it, and I could put it down. And in fact, I did put it down, but just recently picked it back up and finished it. It's published by Anchor Books. George Friedman is quite an interesting character. He's what you would call a geopolitical forecaster on international affairs. Now, I suspect that this book and others that he's written have been sufficiently successful that he could live quite comfortably on those, but he actually owns a company that gives and consults with countries and businesses specifically about the future, predicting what's going to be happening on the international scene and helping people to adjust to that. Well, this is a big picture book, and as one unhappy reviewer pointed out, he affirmed the genius of George Friedman, not because he could see the future, but because he had the sense to write a book that he'll be long dead before it can be proven to be false. He's talking about the next 100 years. That said, what I liked about the book, and I did enjoy it, it's well written. I wouldn't say that it's on par with some of the other more popular writers of books like this. I wouldn't put him with Eric Larson or with Malcolm Gladwell, but he's good. He's comfortable reading him. But what I love about the book is it really does help you think about things that you take for granted that you didn't really understand. Let me give you one basic point, and I'm not trying to do justice to the whole book, But he points out the significance and the meaning of the fact that for the first time in the history of the world, entering into World War II and certainly at the end of World War II, one nation had basically absolute control over two different oceans. Our capacity to control both shipping in the Atlantic and in the Pacific makes us unique in the history of the world as a world power. And that truth is part and parcel of one of his key points, which is his belief that the United States will stay on top of the world as a world power over the course of the next 100 years. And that doesn't mean that he's not aware of various dangers and flashpoints. And in fact, a good percentage of the book is talking about where those flashpoints are, how they're likely to be dealt with, how they're likely to change. He's very confident in a relatively soon crack up of China. And not particularly concerned about China having a big influence on the world. The other thing that I really enjoyed was he takes a chapter or two sort of outlining a war scenario that he sees coming in the distant future, sometime in the 22nd century, that is basically a space-based war, and just not as a novel, and of course we don't know that he's accurate, so we don't know whether it's true either, but written like nonfiction, it was just a pleasure to sort of enter in and try to imagine what that might be like. So, my counsel is, if this is the kind of thing that strikes your fancy, this is one of those books that I'd encourage you to read. He's also written other books, The Emerging Crisis in Europe, The Next Decade, America's Secret War. He's an interesting fellow to read. I'm not a devotee, but I am glad that I invested the time in reading this book. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. If you've read any George Friedman, or maybe you have a favorite George Gilder book that's meant a lot to you, or if you get this book and read this book, I would just love to hear from you and get your thoughts. So, thanks for tuning in. You may recall that in some ways, the segment that we call Forever Friends grew out of a long-running segment that we called Heroes You Never Heard Of. I mentioned that because as I'm thinking about the friends that meant so much to me, I realized that some of them actually made it into that other category. And so I don't want to recover those particular people. One of those people who was in my hero list, who was very much a friend, was Randy Gooder, who was my next door neighbor, keeping in mind that we lived, both of us, on a plot of ground that was 52 some acres, and had maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 houses on it. So this is not a suburb. This is a big piece of property. But Randy was a year older than me, and so there's a very real sense in which I looked up to him. He was also better at me at just about everything. But that growing up on that piece of land was perfectly normal for me, but in many ways extremely unusual. All the blessings that sort of come from a communitarian life with none of the hardships, because those 6 homes on the 52 acres, they were families that worked in the same ministry. We didn't have all things in common, but we lived a life in community. And that included us kids. And so today, in my Forever Friends segment, I'd like to remember the blessing that was Danny Thompson. Also among the heroes that I've talked about in the past was Bill Thompson. Bill was 4 years older than me, and he was Danny's oldest sibling. Danny was probably 2 or 3 years younger than me. I'm not 100% sure which, but he was younger than me. And the Thompson family, they were the very first family to they actually went with us when we moved from Cincinnati to start the Ligonier Valley Study Center. There were two families, the Sprouls and the Thompsons. And I actually knew the Thompsons and spent time playing with Danny Thompson even before we moved to Western Pennsylvania when we lived in Cincinnati. In fact, I have a very clear memory of spending hours taking turns riding down the sidewalk. This was suburban where we were in Cincinnati. Riding down the sidewalk on one of those little four-wheeled, I don't even know what you'd call them. The trike is not the right word. They're little four-wheel things that toddlers sit on, and they had spots on a yellow seat, sort of like either a leopard or a ladybug, and little tiny handles, and we would stick our legs up on those handles and go racing down the hill into the vacant lot and the dirt pile, and I had a great time. But most of what I remember are the many, many years spent with Danny and others in the games that we played together as kids. Whether it was kickball or whether it was hide and seek or those kinds of things. I remember as well sharing with Danny a love for skiing. I remember a particular evening when we found out the night before, A, that school was going to be canceled the next morning, and B, that we were going skiing and just running around like banshees, so excited to know that we would be skiing. There was a time when my parents had to move down to Fort Lauderdale. I was in the 7th grade, I believe, in advance of my sister and me. So we had to spend probably, 2 or 3 weeks to finish out our semesters at our schools with the Thompson family. And I shared a room with Danny and just, again, had a great, great time. In fact, he must have been 3 years younger than me, because I remember also how cool it was that I would get a call from Mrs. Thompson asking me to come babysit. Because I enjoyed Danny so much, it wasn't like a job at all. But I'd get over there, and Danny and I'd find something to do, and I'd make sure he stayed alive, and walk home with some folding money in my pocket. Now, that's been a long time since I've heard from Danny. I was in college, and he came and visited my college for a day. I haven't heard from any of his siblings either. It's been quite a long, long time. But I want him to know that I haven't forgotten him, and I haven't forgotten those times playing in the woods, all sorts of good, fun times together. I pray that Danny is well. I know for sure that his mom has passed away. His mom was probably my mom's best friend for her whole life. And she passed away. The parents divorced after I lost touch with Danny. If you happen to know him, Danny Thompson, it's a pretty common name. I think I'm going to have a hard time tracking him down on the internet. But if you happen to know a Danny Thompson that you maybe mentioned some connection to Ligonier, let him know about this podcast. Let him know that he has a very old friend who still remembers him and still gives thanks for him and prays that he's doing well. And as always, let me encourage you to find a way to track down those who God used to bless you when you were growing up. We are, as you're listening, a week and a half away from the end of what I call legal winter. Legal winter is those 3 months from December 20th or 21st, whichever it is, through March 20th or 21st, when it is technically winter. But I'm afraid even now we're pretty well out of it, even where I live. Lisa is very optimistic, at least from my perspective, in the sense that she keeps telling me that we can get snow as late as May. But the end of winter is not just the end of ever getting snow until next winter. The end of winter is the end of the expectation that there will be snow on the ground most of the time. Now, though I wouldn't yet say that we reached that standard, this particular winter has been better than the others that I've lived here in Fort Wayne in terms of percentage of days with snow on the ground, and we're coming out of a period when we actually had snow on the ground over the course of several weeks. And it's hanging in there depending on which way the sun's shining and shadows and whatnot still in our neighborhood today. But it's shrinking. It's going back. It's like that scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when the White Witch's sleigh will no longer be pulled because there's not sufficient snow on the ground and it's digging into the grass and to the dirt. That's where we're headed. And I don't like it. I don't like it at all. Many of you, I'm sure, are ready to be done. Even there are many who actually enjoy weather, enjoy snow, enjoy seasons, who, when one season ends, look forward to the next. I, however, look forward to the next time it's going to be cold again. I'm looking forward to fall, followed by another winter. So that's my order. My top 4 seasons would be winter, fall, spring, and summer, dragging up the rear. And I want to speak for a moment about the appeal of snow. Part of it is simply weather, and in a sense distinct from the snow itself. That is, in fact, I spent some time living in Mississippi, living in Virginia, living in Kansas, where snow was much more rare than it is here, or where I grew up in Pennsylvania. But it still got cold in the wintertime. And that cold is something that I enjoy. It's just very bracing and makes you feel alert and alive. That's part of what I like. And the heat tends to make me feel kind of sluggish. But the snow itself is also just such a great thing. I mean, what a gift from God. Quite apart from the beauty, which is, we could, and I have written odes to the beauty of the crystals and the unity of the crystals, but just the sheer amount of things that can be done with it. You can glide down it. You can fall on it. You can make snow angels. You can make snow men. Our boys have been making snow caves or tunnels. And for those of you who remember the Forever Friends segment I did about my friend Jim Robbins, boy, one of my great memories of being a teenager was when we dug this tunnel that was so huge you could stand up in it and walk around inside this snow tunnel. Of course, it was right on the edge of a narrow road, so we were risking our lives, but we enjoyed all sorts of things. Snowball fights. There's all sorts of things you can do with snow. But probably the number one thing I like about it is just the way it makes me feel. There's something really nostalgic about the snow that pulls me back to my childhood and to the joy that I had. If you remember, we did a segment in which I talked about what my favorite thing about Christmas was, and I basically said there isn't one thing that's my favorite thing. It's just that sense that it's Christmas. It's, in a sense, the same thing is true about the snow and the winter. It just feels cozy. It just feels secure and safe. And so I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss it a lot. Now, that's not to say there's nothing to be said for spring. One of the things that we've been enjoying of late is the return of the birds. So when we are out for a walk in the bracing cold, we have the sound of the songbirds serenading us. I understand that the color is beautiful that comes with spring and the flowers and the sunshine and all sorts of things to give thanks for. And it is my desire that I would not be grumpy and ungrateful to the Lord, even while I wait for next winter. So today I say goodbye for now to the winter and give a very hopeful see you soon. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.